Sorry. Slight technical difficulties there. My name is Peto. I'm one of the co-chairs of LGBT Labour, and I'd like to welcome all the attendees to this meeting. We've got a great panel to talk about LGBT plus inclusive education and winning the arguments. Just a bit of technical information for those attendees joining us. The attendees will be able to see only the panelists, okay? We can't see any of the attendees. None of the attendees will be up on the screen at all. To submit a question, we'll have a Q&A session shortly. You need to go under the question and answers box. And if you submit those questions, we'll run through and we'll summarize the questions to the panel later. There have been over 200 people who've signed up to join this this talk, this panel. So we won't necessarily get through all of the questions, but we'll do our best. And we'll certainly tackle all the themes that arise. Okay, so just as an introduction, as I say, I'm Peto. I'm one of the co-chairs of LGBT Labour. I will shortly introduce the other panel members for this discussion. But just briefly, I wanted to give a personal experience as to why LGBT inclusive sex and relationship education is so important. Okay, when I was growing up under in the time of Section 28. And I'm bisexual and I'm transgender, but I had no idea what that meant when I was growing up, and no one could tell me about it. So I thought I was attracted to men because I was actually a woman, and I was attracted to women because I was physically male. And it was only when I went to university and someone said, look, Heather, if you're attracted to both sexes, you're bisexual, that the penny dropped, and it was that sort of, you know, face palm sort of moment. So, you know, it's really important that we actually give our children the tools that they need to actually understand themselves. And, you know, the reason for age-appropriate relationship education in primary schools, as well as sex and relationship education in secondary schools, should be obvious. I mean, children should understand, you know, should be able to understand that, you know, the family that they come from is valid, whether that being a family with a single parent, where you have a mum and a dad, two mums, two dads, mum, two dads, all various combinations. Whether you have a parent, sister or brother who's transgender, lesbian, bisexual or gay, or that is your identity yourself, you are welcome. And, you know, you are accepted by the community. And inclusive education is about understanding all minorities and identities and understanding that they are equal. Understanding that you can have many of those identities yourself. You can be Muslim and trans, Jewish and gay, have a disability and be bi. As part of this talk, we've got great panelists here. I'll just give you a brief introduction to what's happened over the last few years. A great example of this inclusive education was developed by Andrew Moffat at Parkfield Community School in Birmingham. It was the No Outsiders programme, which included children's books such as And Tango Makes Three, about same-sex parenting, and Julian is a Mermaid, which looked at gender identity. A small group of protesters who didn't actually have children at the school started to use misinformation to divide local communities by claiming this inclusive education program was an attack on parents' Islamic beliefs. Nearby Anderton Park community is a community where there are 41 spoken languages, and 92% of people are from Muslim or Pakistani heritage. These protesters thought that they could create division and stop inclusive education by actually focusing their protests on Anderton Park Community School, intimidating children, parents and teachers over a 7-month period, and you've probably seen the pictures on the news of this. However, they didn't, you know, these protesters didn't count upon coming across one of our first panelists, Sarah Hewitt-Clarkson, who's head teacher at Anderton Park. Sarah stuck firmly to her guns that children have a right to inclusive education. She took on those protesters and took them to court for the psychological damage they were causing to her children, parents and staff. She won a permanent injunction against those protesters, who were forced to pay 80% of the costs. Ofsted has praised her school for its excellent community spirit, safeguarding and equality. Sarah was named Person of the Year by the Times Educational Supplement last year. These ringleaders of these protests outside Anderton Park, as I say, were not actually parents of children there. So they've moved their protests to other schools in other communities in other cities. And they use WhatsApp and social media to spread their misinformation and get publicity. So it's little wonder that they've actually, some of their protests ended up in Nottingham and Nottinghamshire, where my councillor, Michael Payne, is a councillor in Gedling, Nottinghamshire. He came out as gay in 2014, works with public and private sector organisations in Nottinghamshire to help colleagues feel comfortable and proud to be out in their workplace. He's vice chair of Labour's local government group and is chair of LGBT Councillors Network. Really thankful. Last year, Michael helped us run the LGBT Labour's training day for potential transgender people who wanted to be become Labour councillors. From September 2020, all secondary schools in England will be required to teach pupils about sexual orientation and gender identity as part of sexual relationship education. Primary schools will be required to teach relationships education, which can include LGBT families. Schools in partnerships with local government are consulting on teaching inclusive relationship and SRV to communities and parents. They're consulting their communities and parents. So it is really important to win the arguments on faith. And contrary to how the media reports the arguments about inclusivity of LGBT inclusive education, most people of faith want inclusivity for all minorities. Faith and religion, I speak as someone who's secular, are about love of God. And through that, your God's plan of creation on earth. If you believe in God, then I assume that God has created minorities as well. As I said from the outset, you can be queer and have faith. Janner-Klausner is a trainer, consultant and supervisor in child protection, safeguarding and equality and inclusion. She's a trustee of Iman, an equality network which supports LGBT Muslim people, their families, friends to address issues of sexual orientation with Islam. She's a proud parent. And finally, we have, we have Rabbi Laura Janner-Klausner. She's the senior rabbi to Reform Judaism. She grew up in an Orthodox synagogue and moved to the Reform movement in her teens to become more active in communal life. She's been a campaigning LGBT ally for many years and has a particular interest in faith schools. As soon as she starts speaking, many of you will recognise her. She's a regular contributor to Thought for the Day on the Today programme. So thank you very much to my panellists for joining us. I wonder if, Sarah, you could just give a couple of minutes talk about your experiences and what you'd like to talk about in this meeting.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you very much for asking me to be on this tonight. As Heather said, I'm the head teacher of Anderton Park Primary School, a beautiful school, large primary school down the end of a cul-de-sac, very quiet but very big and very busy. And just over a year ago, we were ambushed really by a group of people. The lead protesters had no kids at my school, and they had kind of moved on from Parkfield and turned up outside my school. And as I said, we're at the end of a cul-de-sac, so a protest with loud hailers and amplification equipment was totally unnecessary. There was no traffic noise to deal with, and the protesters were there almost every single day for 9 weeks at the end of the day. And when we look back at it now, we can't quite believe that we got through that. And in those 9 weeks, we were at Birmingham City Council School, and we worked with BCC to take the lead protesters to court to get an injunction. And we actually went to court 3 times for various processes, and we ended up with a judgment in November. And the court case was not about LGBT. The court case was about protesting and whether it had really crossed the line into causing harm. But in the course, we ended up as a 5-day trial in October for this. And I was cross-examined for 6.5 hours on my beliefs and what we were doing in school, and what we are doing in school is very minimal. We don't do the No Outsiders program. We just weave equality into everything we do. We've always done that. We don't have a separate lesson. We don't have separate books. But the point is, we would not say some people have 2 mummies, for example. We wouldn't not say that because some people do. And while many children at my school are religious, and religion plays a massive part in many of my children's lives, which is a good thing, British law sometimes is different to religious law. And while we respect both, the religious bit does not override the British law bit that says LGBT people are equal to non-LGBT people. And that's it. And I'm a public servant, and I'm a head teacher, and I must make sure that every child in my school at a completely age-appropriate way, they understand that, and they leave my school knowing that all aspects of equality are equal, and one is not more important than the other. So we got through it, we won the court case, but it was very tough. And there were times when I thought my soul was crushed, but it hasn't been. And it's all massive tribute to the staff and everybody at school. So I'm always pleased to talk about these issues because they are very interesting, and they're very, very super important.
Thank you, Sarah. If I could ask Michael to say a few words, say a little bit, introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Heather, and thanks for inviting me to this this webinar. It's fantastic. And let me just start by saying that, you know, if I'd have been a pupil in a school like Sarah's back when I was at primary school, I don't think it had taken me to the age of 27 until 2014 to have the self-confidence to come out as a gay man in the workplace and in public office. I was brought up in a very friendly and welcoming environment amongst friends and family, and my school was a fantastic school, but I have no doubt at all that a part was played in there being a lack of appropriate relationship and sexual education in both my primary and secondary school, for the reasons that actually I didn't have the confidence, even though I had gay friends and friends from the LGBT plus community and a very supportive family, to come out publicly until 2014. And I think the leadership that Sarah and her colleagues showed at Anderton Primary School was absolutely outstanding, and I know the personal pressure it put people like Sarah and her colleagues under. And I guess that's just really where I want to start about local government's role. 30 years on from the time when a British Prime Minister stood on a major party conference platform, Margaret Thatcher, in 1987, and said that she thought it was unacceptable that people were being taught that they had an inalienable right to be gay. There is a duty, a moral duty, and a legal duty for people like me as Labour councillors to stand shoulder to shoulder with people like Sarah in the education profession and our esteemed colleagues who are joining us on the panel, as well as both allies and our colleagues in the faith communities. Really, my view is that as Labour councillors, whether we're from the LGBT plus community or not, we have a responsibility to show very public support for schools like Sarah's, who are doing the right thing, who are making sure that the identities of LGBT community are not wiped out of education, and that children don't go home to their families thinking that they don't have a right to be who they want to be, love who they want to be, and show emotion towards people that they want to show emotion towards. Certainly councils can pass the fantastic model motion that the LGBT Labour organisation has created, publicly display that their councils are in support of appropriate relationship sexual education within schools in their communities, and also to show community leadership. some of what I saw in Birmingham and some of what I saw in Nottinghamshire was nothing short of reprehensible, and I think it should be called out as such. And it shames me, let me just say, that Labour members of Parliament were allowed to provide oxygen and fuel to people who were targeting the likes of Sarah and her colleagues, and colleagues of mine who were Labour councillors in Birmingham City Council. And I don't think we should have any truck with calling out people in our own party and in our own movement when they overstep the line and try to pander to people who don't really have a moral or legal argument to stand on. So I think the crucial role here of councillors is to show community leadership, is to not be apologetic, is to make sure that you are furnished with the appropriate information and the facts, because often, I think Sarah would agree with this, what we see from these protesters is misinformation, supposition, trying to mislead people and actually not presenting the facts. And also make use of the fantastic organisation, Heather, that you and your colleagues do so well in running, which is LGBT Labour. I wouldn't be where I was if it weren't for the likes of the trailblazers from LGBT Labour and the community leaders and politicians and faith leaders and people like Sarah who have shown real leadership in the face of hostility. I wouldn't be elected into office and be able to be the person that I want to be and love the people that I want to be loving today if it weren't for the fantastic work of all those organisations. So a huge thank you to me, a message from us in Labour local government that we'll stand shoulder to shoulder with our colleagues in the education profession. And if there are any councillors joining us tonight, please make sure that you play your role in standing up for our younger people and making sure that that relationship and sexual education advice is there in your local schools, and that you are doing your part to help with that.
Great, thank you, Michael. And I should say that it was good that we actually, the Labour Party for once, acted relatively quickly, and by the last general election had got rid of Roger Godsiff from the party. And Anjum, sort of like, perhaps you'd like to say a few.
Hi, I'm Anjum Mouj, and I'm a trustee of Imam. Actually, more so, you know, I am a, what can I say? I am a parent, I am a Muslim, and I am a lesbian. And I think that surmises who I am. Imam, I belong to Imam, a charity that was established in 1999, and our charity campaigns to ensure that no LGBTQI plus Muslim in Britain feels excluded from their family, feels excluded from their faith or their community. We're a small volunteer-led charity, and we really aim to represent the breadth of the Islamic faith and range of identities and narratives from the LGBT community and our allies. And that's the work that we do. I think it needs to be said that the values of inclusion, the values of diversity, the values of appreciating, enjoying, growing from difference, and not just British values. They are universal values, ultimately. And it's a narrow group of people that have defined them to, you know, or taken hold of them in a religious perspective in a negative way. They're values that are held globally. Clearly, in the United Kingdom, you know, we're in a complex situation. We have to, we must acknowledge that. We have to, I guess for me, recognize that the complexity of this is that, you know, there is on the one hand, Muslims being under threat in an increasingly hostile environment. That level of Islamophobia, it's on the rise. I mean, Heather, you've said it yourself, politicians have not been on our side. They've failed to tackle Islamophobia and in fact have added fuel to that fire. There is no doubt about that. And the British media is sadly, what would you say, notorious for its anti-Muslim reporting. And Muslims appear disproportionately, if you like, in the press in a negative light. So it's no surprise, I would say, that perhaps some Muslim parents are defensive about protecting what are their religious identities. However, a religious identity, and I too have faith, and nobody can take my faith. And also I have a sexual orientation that is lesbian, and I didn't choose it. I was born this way, you know. I have a God-given right to be who I am. God made me just as God made everybody else that has a religious identity that I also share. We can be, and we are LGBTQI, of course we are. Parents, Muslim parents cannot bury their head in the sand in terms of the realities of the world. As I say, there is a global inclusive culture and domain. And you know, ultimately, Imam have supported many thousands of Muslims over the last 20 years. And the most common issues, and I think this in this COVID-19 era, these are going to be cropping up for us, aren't there? That Muslims in the UK, actually, unfortunately, many of the hostilities that they're facing are from their own families. We need to be talking about that as Muslims. We need to be talking about that as people of faith. Our families need to hold us and take care of us. You know, we're often ostracized, shunned from the family, forced to live double lives, and you know, and sometimes even pressured into marrying the opposite sex, ruining two lives in one go. What is that about? That is not Islamic. That cannot be faith-led. You know, that is just cruel and absurd. You know, of course, you know, there's so many issues, depression, anxiety that go on with that community. So I would say, you know, that Imam, for many years, we've just been trying to build relationships with the wider Muslim community and some of the prominent mosques, if you like. But unfortunately, that reaction has been that we've often been ignored. And I think that we need to have a strong voice also within the different political parties, and that intersectionality and that inclusiveness needs to be really taken on board. And of course, you know, to silence us and to silence this voice and to say that, you know, somebody else's rights can step all over my rights doesn't make a sense. Thank you for inviting me. I'm so pleased to be speaking here today.
Thank you, Anjum. You're very welcome. Rabbi Janner-Klausner, do you want to say things? I'm sorry if I've mispronounced that.
First, good evening. Good evening, and Ramadan Kareem. I just want to make your life so much easier. Please call me Rabbi Laura, because else it's just going to take the rest of the time after just saying the last name. I just want to say, I don't have an interest in faith schools. I'm interested in them being okay. I have a lot of doubts about faith schools, and I was a faith schools governor for 9 years in order to get my grubby paws on the curriculum to make sure that it was decent and inclusive. And I think one of the ways that you measure faith schools is by what's not taught, and trying to work out how you're going to supplement that primary, not primary in age, key curriculum. I suppose about myself, I just want to add, you know, clause 28 trauma to it. I'm 56, so that was when I was much younger, and it was absolutely disgusting, despicable. From the point of view of Judaism, we have a very strong rule that says the law of the land is the law. So it's not just the content, but we have to keep to the curriculum. And so we have an interesting dynamic with an increasingly growing number of ultra-Orthodox, strictly Orthodox, radically Orthodox Jews who will probably be the majority of the Jewish world in Britain and other places in I don't know, 30 years, something like that. So it's going to cause a very interesting dynamic. And in their schools, they tend to dodge Ofsted, and they certainly aren't keen on SRE or RSE, which I find very infuriating. There's one important thing about, for me particularly, about the same person that teaches you geography, maths, teaching you these subjects, because it's not the other. And I love that, which is why the embedding in the school system by the teacher, I mean, you might want to get specialists to talk about certain things, and that's sort of interesting and having something outside, but basically having the same person who goes, no, you can't divide it like that, you have to divide it like this, talk about SRE. There's something so holistic, which is an antidote to the othering that might otherwise happen. That's it.
Thank you, Rabbi Laura. So the first question, we're going to, I don't want to talk too much about COVID-19 because I know it's dominating all conversations quite rightly at the moment, and I want to look at, in the long term, how we engage positively with communities and with the arguments on SRE. But I think on inclusive SRE, but I think actually the COVID-19 is an important thing and shines a spotlight, if you like, to how many people have problems with their families and what it must be like living at home. So our first question was, how might children living at home 24/7 during lockdown be affected, and especially children with LGBT identities? Why does this illustrate the importance of schools, your friends, and the need for inclusive education? Yeah. Who would like to start with that?
I can say something on that as a head teacher. Is that okay? So yeah, we're in a very interesting time. When we think about safeguarding in schools, we always start off our safeguarding training with the obvious yet very important thing to state, that schools are in a very unique position when it comes to safeguarding, because parents drop their children off and then the parents go home. And really that is the only time when parents do that. If parents take a child to the doctors, to A&E, to a pharmacist, to the hairdressers, almost entirely the parent is with the child. So in a school situation, children are dropped off and they're with us for 5.5 or 6 hours, and then their parents pick them up. That is a very, very special relationship that schools have with children. That means they can talk to us, they disclose things to us, we may notice differences in their behaviour, in their attitudes, in how they're feeling, and in this lockdown period, that is very, very difficult. All the teachers at my school, and I think in all schools, are phoning pupils regularly, so that they can hear their teacher's voice, and it's a familiar thing, and the teacher can say, how are you getting on with things? Have you managed to do anything off the website? How are your mum and dad? How's your dad? Have you been outside? How are you eating healthily? And that is absolutely brilliant, and the parents are loving it, the kids are loving it, the staff are loving it. So regular, once a week, once every 2 weeks, all teachers speak to their children in their class. Brilliant. But that doesn't help safeguarding, because almost entirely there will be an adult in the room with the child, rightly, while they're speaking to their teacher. In fact, some parents were a bit worried about that, and we said, look, put us on speakerphone. You know, this is not a secret conversation at all. But that has taken away that element of we're in school, we have posters all around school saying, if you're worried about anything, you can talk to any of us, but if you want to find somebody particular, here are the faces of the people you can talk to, like all the DSLs in school. So that particular aspect of safeguarding while we're in lockdown is very difficult, and there's almost no answer to it, because doing home visits, I go to houses almost every day and drop some food off or drop some work off, but I knock on the door, I step back, we may have a conversation 2 meters away, I see the child, I say hi, and then I go. So there's none of that kind of one-to-one or small group contact at all. So those aspects of all aspects of safeguarding are very, very tricky at the moment, while almost all children are at home.
Yeah, and I would say as well, that perspective of sort of, you know, schools are in that ideal position to also know their pupils and like really understand their, you know, any complexities that they've got in life. So ultimately, before we were in this position, there's many teachers, many designated safeguarding lead officers, many teaching staff that actually know what some of the things might be happening with that child, and therefore that welcome voice, that, you know, is so nourishing. It's so, you know, it's so critical, because it is also part of that taking care of somebody's mental health when they're in this environment of isolation and perhaps spending more time in those, quite tense family situations where perhaps they can't be out. The only place that they might be out, or there might be some idea of their identity, might be within the school network. So to have that voice that Sarah is talking about, to have that connection is really important. And I guess, ultimately, keeping children safe in education gives us a mandate, gives teaching staff a mandate to basically be checking in and looking out for their pupils and supporting them. And this is part of that framework, and how important. We've talked so much already about Section 28. Certainly I grew up in an environment whereby actually I had no words to define who I was for a very, very long time. And it's that, there was no conversation about that. And I like to think that we've got some, more discussions about that happening within schools, but I'm not 100% convinced, because we, ultimately the chatter of the parents and community will dominate too.
Sorry, technical issue of me hitting the wrong button. Michael, do you want to say anything about the effects in community?
One of the things I think councils have to think about, clearly we're thinking about vulnerable elderly people who are susceptible to COVID-19, but as Sarah's demonstrated, we should also be thinking about vulnerable young people and the impacts that coronavirus is having on them. And can we use some of the existing networks that some councils around the country with their youth mayors or their youth councils? And indeed, if you're in a council where you've got responsibility for children's care and social care, can some of those resources be deployed to make sure that we're supporting schools in reaching out to those where we know there may be a risk in the family, or actually people who we know may want people to speak to? So I think councils have got a role as well to stand alongside schools in making sure that resources are also deployed, not only to support elderly people and vulnerable people who are medically susceptible to coronavirus, but actually people who may be impacted in the way that I think has been described in terms of children being at home who haven't got the day-to-day networks that they would ordinarily have, being able to go out and about with their friends, or being in school where they've got pre-existing relationships with their teachers, or with people who work at the school, or colleagues in the class. So I think councils need to be making sure that they're supporting schools in doing some of the excellent work that clearly Sarah's school and other schools around the country are doing.
Right. So the next question, if we move on to the next question, is about deliberate misinformation being used to try and divide communities. And it was, how did deliberate misinformation fuel protests outside Anderton Park and other schools? And should the media really have given such a platform to these group of protesters? Perhaps Rabbi Laura, would you like to talk about this?
Well, I feel funny without Sarah going first, but do you want to go first? Because
let me.
Do you mind? And then I'm happy to carry on, but I just feel sort of, is that all right? I can't hear you anyway, so.
Okay, am I good to go to talk about this? Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, so the protest happened outside my school, and the court case actually focused quite a lot on misinformation. And I haven't got the judgment in front of me, but the Justice Warby, when he gave us this judgment, 48 pages of judgment, talked in a lot of that about the deliberate misinformation, and sometimes he used the word grossly misinformation and exaggerated information to such an extent that it caused harm. So outside my school, some of the things that would be shown or be chanted, Hewitt-Clarkson is a liar, that was a regular thing, that I must go, I must stand down. Leaflets were handed out of gingerbread men with penises. Later on, there were things that with schools, including mine, were teaching about masturbation. leaflets were handed out several times about this is what is being taught in your school. They are teaching your children this. I mean, the pictures of the gingerbread man I've never ever seen, and I just have no idea where they come from. But it was an interesting part of our court case, and the kind of the balance between the right to protest, and protesting is legal, it's a democratic right, and also it is meant to upset people. It's meant to agitate a situation, but there aren't any rules about where that's appropriate. It takes somebody like our school and Birmingham City Council to take people to court to say this is not okay. So for a long time, those people could say almost whatever they wanted to, even if it was highly offensive. So Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, was one of the banners. And police were there every day. So the police did not ask them to take that down. They said it was homophobic, but it wasn't inciting homophobic hatred, because it wasn't saying, and go out and hurt gay people. So all of these things were so painful for us to have to listen to and put up with, and not just listen to in any kind of reasoned, calm discussion, but chanted and shouted and screamed down megaphones. And for half an hour, for 40 minutes, for 45 minutes at the end of every day, and using words and phrases that 3-year-olds wouldn't have heard. They wouldn't have heard those things in my school. And so the kind of juxtaposition of nonsense that my little kids, well, all my kids were having to hear, that they were hearing from non-parents and a few parents, and the kind of craziness that created questions from the children that they would never have had unless the protesters had been there. And this idea that I was this huge diva activist, that my whole life I was obsessed with gay people, and that's all I was interested in, and all I wanted to talk about at school was being gay. But actually the fact was that all we were saying, and all I insisted we said at school when it was appropriate and every now and then, was things like, some people have 2 daddies, because they do. And yet that tiny but very, very important part of school life was taken and demonized, and was the words abomination were used many times. And we're talking about human beings here. And what was really painful for me and for my school was that I felt, not just felt, I think it was true, that the LGBT issue was allowed to be talked about like this, in a way that I don't think we would talk about religion like this. I don't think if somebody was standing outside my school saying very abusive things about different religions, that different religions were an abomination, or don't you tell my child about this, or I don't want any Muslim or Jewish or Sikh person sitting next to my child, we just would have closed that argument down. It would just not have even been a thing. But because it was LGBT, it was allowed to be a bit of a debate. And you can't debate. You can listen and you can talk about things calmly, but you can't scream down a megaphone that being gay is an abomination, and that this is disgusting and it's ruining childhood, and all of these kind of things. It was just, I felt like it was allowed, this debate was allowed to happen, where it wouldn't have happened if it was another protected characteristic. And a lot of that was to do with misinformation and deliberately trying to scare parents to either join a protest or ask for my resignation, or say move your child to another school, because that whole thing of, well, there's no smoke without fire, and all those she only invites gay people into school. She's looking to invite she only wants gay teachers. Just nonsense. And actually, when you're battered with that, as say a young mom who's trying just to get her child or children home quietly, that's really hard to say, I don't agree with you, actually, that's not true, or I've known this school for a long time and those things aren't true. It's really hard, and it's a deliberate attempt to crush people and to make them believe terrible things about me and about the school and the staff.
Thank you, Sarah. Rabbi Laura, do you want to say a few words?
So thank you. It's incredibly inspiring listening to you, has to be said. You're sort of like the opposite of a protest, in a way. By you being there and talking kind of galvanizes you. I suppose the things that go through my head are about platforms and where are religious leaders in this alongside the school system. and how we can be used better, and how we can also be outed about terrible views. So, and I'm relating to one of the questions later, there's a question about the C of E exemption in 2012, is it? And it's not acceptable that that's happening with the C of E. It's not acceptable in my eyes that strictly radical Jewish schools basically get let off the hook for it. It's not acceptable, I think, that it happens in some sections of the Muslim communities. And one of the things that I can say, I suppose, because I do loads of work with Muslim communities, is the issue of LGBT plus is so, I mean, well done you, is all I can say, because it is the most open-minded, interfaithy, brave people won't talk about it. They just won't. It's so marginal. So we have a real role as religious leaders to start saying the truth on this.
Equally, I would say so many, such a great discussion there in terms of who could get involved with this, and I think that's right. So many people are just stepping out of this, but I think the modelling is absolutely imperative, isn't it? If a government, if a system models this behaviour, that some religions can be excluded, then of course you're going to have exactly what happened outside of Sarah's school. That is going to happen. In a way, they're the building blocks that could lead to those situations. I'm not saying that equates exactly that and that's why it happened, but I'm saying fundamentally, one has to be able to take on this debate in a way that actually it's not okay for this, and it's this for this religious community to bar same-sex marriages. If that church doesn't, that can't be okay. And then we're really upset that Muslim parents are outside the school. It wasn't just Muslim parents, was it? It was Christian parents as well. It was actually any religious community that wanted to have a go, and many of them did, at LGBTQI people, and that conversation, that's where they went. And this becomes this issue about, where people say, well, it's my right. Well, it's also LGBTQI, God-given right to be who we are. I'm a mother, I'm a lesbian mother. What should I do? Should I not take my child to school in case some people work out that we're a same-sex couple who've got a child? 10-year-old, absolutely amazing, just to let you know. So what is this about? And I find it, there's that old joke here, isn't there? It's like, what happened here? If we're saying, just by saying so-and-so's got two dads, or so-and-so's got two mums, or, so-and-so is in a non-monogamous relationship, or so-and-so is bisexual, or so-and-so is trans, are we saying that that's what people model and become? Because, most of the world, isn't it, is heterosexual. So hang on, something in the formula isn't working, So ultimately, I think that modelling and that leadership has to be absolutely spot on. And I think the Labour Party also, we have to look at the leadership there. What was stopping just a massive flow of Labour leaders going and supporting the school staff within those schools? What was stopping those conversations? And actually, why did we pander to conversations that councillors, that leaders of the council, that mayors were having about the fact that it was okay to stay silent on this issue? You're in positions of leadership, surely, councillors, mayors, leaders of councils. You're not leading if you decide that you can persecute a community. And as Sarah said, if that was about race, or if that was about disability, or if that was about any other protected characteristic, goodness me, if we started talking about the fact that actually, what we should stop doing is that everybody should stop getting married, we should just have civil partnership. Why is it that we 2005, LGBT, if you're lesbian and you're gay, guess what, we'll give you a civil partnership. That's not equality. Everybody knows that was Labour leadership. Everybody knows true equality would have been, wouldn't it, at that point, or much earlier really, we should have had the right to marriage. And of course things progress and it's good to see. but we should be questioning ourselves. We should be thinking about why we let those things happen. And then maybe we can have some understanding about these, you know, in a way, why that, you know, stress and that pressure was put on to people like Sarah to have to battle it. Where was the leadership? And not just Labour, of course.
Yes, I mean, you're quite right. I mean, there was a gulf in political leadership. I mean, I'm particularly looking at the Education Secretary at that time, who was quite quiet in terms of his support for inclusive education and the schools that were dealing with these protests. But certainly Labour politicians need to engage as well. I'm just going to move on to the next question now, which comes from Stephen, and it's and he writes, our council wrote to all our schools to make it clear that we support them teaching LGBT plus inclusive education. What other steps can councils take to show schools they are supporting them in delivering inclusive education? And Michael, perhaps you'd like to kick off on this.
I think one of the things that you can do is to raise awareness and campaign on the issue of LGBT related bullying in our schools across Britain. 50% of LGBT pupils facing bullying in their school environment as a result of being from the LGBT plus community, and 64% of trans pupils facing bullying as a result of being trans pupils. And I think councils absolutely have got a role working with colleagues in education in schools to raise awareness and campaign on that issue, so that children who live and pupils who live in their respective areas that they represent see that the council and the community leaders and their councillors and local politicians are taking this issue seriously and understand the concerns that they face. I certainly have been back to my primary school and my secondary school to speak to people about my own experiences and groups. And I think if you're somebody from the LGBT community, or indeed you're an ally, as we have colleagues on the panel tonight and attendees, then go and speak to people, you know, and give an opportunity for people to talk as well. Clearly, as I said, raising awareness about the issue and showing community leadership by passing a motion in the council, but then following through that with action, you know, as community leaders, going to meet with your local head teachers and pupils to understand the facts about the education programmes that they're teaching or not to the pupils. And I think the other thing you can do as community leaders is not leave the good fight to people like Sarah when there are protests. Go and engage, be armed with the facts, be clear that we're making no excuses or apologies for the identity of LGBTQ plus pupils in schools, and have those conversations. And the other thing is, you know, I think Anjum is absolutely right. Where we see the Labour movement and the Labour Party falling short, call it out, and call it out clearly and publicly. And I did that about Roger Godsiff on a public platform when I saw what he was doing. And I just want to speak up for, and I know Sarah will know this, one or two of the councillors who did absolutely show leadership on this from Birmingham City Council as a result, like Sarah, took you know, persecution from some of those protesters as a result, but did what is absolutely, as Anjum said, the right thing to do, standing by those who we need to. And the other thing, of course, is you can request people to come and speak from LGBT Labour, you know, or from other groups, you know, so that pupils can hear from people who have got different experiences from the LGBT plus community. And let me just finish by saying, Heather, that we have a crucial role as councils in political leadership in calling out the abject failure of government in the issue that happened at Anderton Park and what's happened in Nottinghamshire. It was shameful that the Secretary of State, that the Prime Minister, that senior cabinet members, and indeed, as Anjum said, senior leaders from other political parties, leaders of the opposition parties, were reluctant to get involved, did not want to get involved, were quite happy to leave this to Anderton Park and Birmingham City Council to deal with. And I'm sorry, I will say it clearly, I think that was a deliberate decision. I think it was a convenient and deliberate decision. And I think councils have got to say, yes, we've got a role to play. Yes, our colleagues in the education profession and in faith and in community organisations have a role to play, but government has to play a role here as well, because bad things happen when good people stand by and do nothing. And what we saw from cabinet ministers in relation to the issue at Anderton Park was them washing their hands and hand-wringing about an issue that they should have got involved with and should have stood by Sarah and her colleagues on. And I think as local political leaders, we have a right and a responsibility and a moral duty to be robust with government where we think it's failing on these issues.
Thank you. Sarah, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just very briefly, I'd say to councils, don't leave it up to Ofsted to make a judgment about schools on these matters. Get into schools, get into every single school in your borough or your city council, and say, right, well, you know, what's the evidence? When we walk around your school, who's represented it, and on the walls, in the books, how you talk about people in assemblies, is a representation from all of the protected characteristics, and how are they talked about? Talk to the children, and you know, if you talk to them about all aspects of equality, how do the children respond? Because if they respond by going, that's not right, then it's a failure, a huge failure. And so councils should take this seriously. It should be an absolute non-negotiable, and they should use it as an opportunity, not just to firefight when something goes wrong, but to use it as an opportunity to celebrate how fantastic our communities are and diverse, and that schools play a huge role in this. This is education. We acknowledge that sometimes people will do something differently at home. One dad said to me, you know, he'd just laugh at his child if his little boy put a dress on at home. And I said, well, that's the difference between education and home. In school, we could not laugh, and we will not laugh at a little boy if they did that. You can really do what you want at home. There are no safeguarding measures placed on parents, unfortunately, or very few, when it comes to things like this. But there are on all school staff. There is a legal duty and a moral duty to make sure we are doing the right thing on this. So councils, take it seriously, make it absolutely non-negotiable. Don't just talk about religion and faith, talk about all of the protected characteristics, and go into your schools and look for evidence that that is happening and celebrate it. Don't look at it upon it as a problem, which is something to be sorted. Use it as an absolutely positive thing, and get into schools.
Again, I almost press the wrong button. Apologies. Another question, this time from Charlotte. She says, do you have any practical tips for me as a primary school teacher leading on PSAP on what to do to ensure inclusive RSE is embedded across my school, and also how to proactively engage parents and faith communities to get them on board? And perhaps, I'm sorry, Sarah, you've just spoken, but perhaps if we could bring you in first on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's many things in that question, Charlotte, but it's a great question. The number one thing I would say is don't look upon it, like Anjum said, I think earlier, as something separate. Don't look at it upon, Rabbi Laura was saying, you know, the same teacher teaches you everything. That's so important. It shouldn't be a kind of, oh, this is really awkward and how am I going to deal with it? It's just part of life. It's not a lesson, it's everything. So the books you read in an English lesson, or the maths questions you ask in a maths lesson, you should have a thought about equality and how you're asking those questions. So weave it into everything. How you must engage with families wherever you are, because if you believe in relationships, that's our number one value at Anderton Park, which is why what happened to us was so awful. Our values are relationships, determination, and the ability to sparkle is our third one. But relationships, so if you mean relationship important, you've got to talk with people, not to people, but talking means listening as well. So we must listen to when parents go, this book or this idea makes me really uncomfortable. Why is that? Let me listen to you and understand that. Because if you just go, no, I'm not listening to that, there will be a barrier, and barriers are what they are. They stop people from understanding each other. So when we had our meetings with parents, which we still have, I made sure that leading those meetings were two of my members of staff who are devoutly Muslim, two of my members of staff who are devoutly Christian, so that I am not a religious person. I have tons of faith in people and goodness, but I'm not religious. So I made sure there were people who could ask those questions and be part of answering those questions, rather than it seeming like I'm the head teacher, I'm making all decisions, I will decide what we do, because it's not about that. But you have to quietly and very resolutely and robustly not be part of any watering down, not be part of, well, can you only do that in year 6, please, because that would make me feel happier. You have to calmly find ways of saying, that's not going to happen. That doesn't happen with skin colour or gender or any of those things. Therefore, we would simply be discriminating if we allowed only year 6 children to know about families with 2 daddies, for example.
Thank you. Anjum, would you like to come in on that?
I was just going to, I mean, really echo everything that's been said, Sarah, eloquently, and Michael as well, and Rabbi Laura. I think as well, it's just the importance of literature, and when I'm thinking about actually the values work that we do in schools, the values work that we do with teachers, interviewing skills that we have with people that are going to have that much influence and impact over our children is really important. We have to be discussing values. We have to know actually what each of our staff stand for in schools and what they would fight for, and you know, and those things are, you know, pulling that out, I guess, in terms of culture and society is really important. So I go back to leadership. Leadership define actually how we express those values as well, and that's really important. And I would say, Sarah, of you, you know, you embed the values of your school, your personal everything. You know, you're definitely sparkle, and you're definitely a fight night, and you care about relationships, and you know that you know that brings to life something, doesn't it? It's so important. You know, do we have books in school that talk to us about same-sex relationships, or is that the book that we hide away? You know, is it just part of the literature, the posters that we have up in schools? Are we showing intersectionality in that way? Are we really having? We don't. Actually, it becomes that other subject. We otherize it so well. We put it back there. We all push it into the closet. We really do. We push so much into the closet. There's so much dialogue and discussion that needs to happen. And some of that happens, people learn in different ways. It happens through images, positive images, visuals, actually conversations that we have, making sure that we are considerate and concerned about people's pronouns, and actually bringing that up all of the time so that people are inclusive in their language by the language that they use is really important. Thinking about actually how we incorporate that into our everyday is uber critical, and we have to train people to be able to do that. We have to train people to understand their unconscious biases and their conscious biases and their prejudice, and the fact that they have that, and the fact that some people have privilege and they need to maintain an awareness of that. And when people have privilege, they also have the power to call things out, and that's the stuff that we really need to be embedding a bit more, that I think we miss. You know, I'd love to see more books. You know, I didn't see a book that represented a person like me of my colour, never mind my faith or my sexual orientation, you know, or any, you know, any intersectionality. I never saw that growing up in school. I didn't see my representation on television. I actually didn't know that these things could be for me. So, you know, this is it with 2020. You know, definitely we need to be thinking about, you know, how we have inclusivity in everything that we deliver on, and that it, you know, it comes from a place that isn't tokenistic. It comes from a place that is really embedding and really serious about actually taking issues forward in a progressive way.
Thank you. Rabbi Laura, would you like to come in? Anything? I think you're muted, Rabbi Laura.
It's someone else's fantasy, quite honestly. So mute that woman. Children need models that are not other, like teachers, to emulate and imitate as learning. Parents and religious leaders, whatever, need other, and that's why I think what you did is very wise, Sarah, about bringing other people in, both so they can't belittle you or dismiss you as like you're not religious, but also the role of modelling and authority, and not just modelling, which and John, you were talking about before, but actually is about legislation. So when you have religious authorities giving a view, giving a ruling, it is the most impactful thing. You know, you have a fatwa on something, is massively impactful. Vatican II changed the face of the globe because it was the Pope, and because Catholicism is an authoritarian type of religion where you have an authority figure who said, we are not having that relationship with Jews anymore, thank you so much. And it changed relationships pretty much overnight in attitude. So I think for parents, bringing in external authority figures is the way. A way.
Thank you, Rabbi Laura. Final question. I'm afraid we're running short on time. It's from Joe, and he writes, or she writes, I'm not sure the pronouns. Do you think the regulations and enforcement mechanisms for inclusive RSE are strong enough to ensure no school can choose not to teach this vital part of the curriculum, particularly faith schools? Michael, perhaps you'd like to kick us off on that.
I think we need to be learning from organisations like Anjums and people who have clearly led the way in relation to some of the work from our faith communities. I'm always nervous about automatically saying that, and I know this isn't what's being suggested from the question, that all faith schools, are problematic because, faith comes first, and therefore, values around LGBT plus communities, are not included in that. I agree with Anjum. These are not British values or a value that are the monopoly of one particular faith. They are values that are universal and that we share with faith organisations, with people of different sexuality, people of different gender around the world. So I think there's always more that can be done in terms of enforcing things. Part of the problem, I think, from a council's perspective, and Sarah talked about this, is the role of councils clearly in terms of the coalition's changes in education legislation has watered down the more formal role that councils had in terms of being able to work with and alongside and actually hold to account schools and vice versa, and have a close relationship. Here, the academisation programme, the free school programme, turned it into a kind of Secretary of State sat behind a desk in Whitehall making decisions about schools in Birmingham or Nottinghamshire or Manchester or Cornwall, which is clearly ludicrous. Clearly there were issues with some local authorities meddling and thinking they knew about more about education than education professionals like Sarah, but there's still a community leadership role for councils to play, and I think it's certainly taught me something hearing from Sarah tonight to say that just because councils don't have a formal role in education, nothing to stop you going in and having conversations with each individual school and working alongside education professionals and showing some community leadership. So yes, I think Joe's right, there is absolutely more that can be done around enforcement, but I'd just say a cautionary note, Anjum started on this, that we should also just be careful about painting all faith schools as as being problematic in terms of teaching LGBTQ plus values. I know that's not what Joe's suggesting, but there are some outstanding organisations like the Church of England, Catholic Education Service, Anjum's own organisation, that have shown real leadership here on some of these values, and we need to learn from them. We need to make sure that we're sharing that best practice with other schools.
Thank you. Rabbi Laura, do you want to come in and particularly talk about problems with perhaps faith schools wanting to opt out and what could be done to stop that, etc.? But obviously,
law and law. That's it. Regulation and I want to say regulation, observation, but only because I'm so knackered. Regulation and ensuring that it's delivered. No messing about. And the Church of England exemption is disgusting, by the way.
Thank you very much. Anjum, would you like to come in next? And I'll finish off with Sarah's experience on this.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, ultimately, we are, we're telling schools exactly what they can teach on so much of the time, but we can't do it about this. That is about something, isn't it? That's the message. What's the law? What's the regulation? Do it properly. This is, this is half-hearted. This is half-handed. This isn't right. And if you think that ultimately, we can have some laws that give some equality to LGBTQI people, and some laws that support them within schools, but some laws that don't go all the way. And guess what? We can work with some teachers who are open to it and open to the teaching in an open way, but some teachers who are, who don't want to teach it, we can say to them they don't have to do it. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. And it's ultimately, of course, that's exactly what's going to set up protests outside schools, isn't it? Because that gateway, that door is open. It's not even a back door. You've opened that front door wide open. People are going to walk into it. Legislate, regulate, make sure that we have leadership. When these things crop up, stand with us shoulders to shoulder ultimately recognise that we are standing on the shoulders of giants, aren't we? People. It was the trans community, it was the LGBT community that actually has supported so much of progressive discussion. Just recognise all of that and move with it, and in a progressive way. I think it's really critical. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah, do you want to come in?
Yeah, very quickly, I think the answer to Joe's question is no, they're not strong enough, because if they were, as Andrew said, I wouldn't have had protests. I said to one of the police chiefs in the West Midlands, when somebody smashed a window in a mosque, you stood within an hour of that happening on live TV saying, this is absolutely terrible. People should be free to worship wherever they want safely. I said, why haven't you said that about love? Why haven't you said, these protests are terrible. People are free to love whoever they want to love. How come it's so easy to say that about a place of worship or somebody's race, but when it comes to LGBT, nobody says anything? So the police really, and the DFE, so the DFE documentation, on first reading, I thought, this is amazing, this is brilliant. It got through the House of Commons with a massive majority, but kind of the small print, the get out clauses in the small print, and it's gone through the House of Commons and it's gone through the House of Lords, and really those kind of little grey areas have now gone through as law. So we're left with lawful grey areas, which are awful and have led to what happened outside my school. Very damaging to everybody, not just LGBT community, but to the Muslim community, because the vast majority of parents at my school were saying, I do not stand with those people. And once again, it's a tiny few people who are painting, or who believe they're speaking on behalf of all Muslims, and of course they're not. They're speaking on behalf of themselves. So there are many things that need tightening up. Things to do with the police, definitely things to do with the DFE and what it says. But then there's the public sector equality duty, which makes it crystal clear what people like me should do and have to do by law. And yet, you know, I still have to go to court and be cross-examined for 6.5 hours about whether it's all right to have two mummies. I mean, it's just crazy. So no, it's not tight enough and it's not clear enough. But that's why, you know, evenings like tonight are really important to keep this debate live and make sure, whatever position we're in society, we can keep pushing to get absolute parity with the protected characteristics, which they clearly are not currently.
Yes, as soon as you have grey areas, you start to legitimise debate in areas that it shouldn't be legitimate about equality, debates about equality. Michael, you wanted to come in as well and say a few more words on that.
Quickly to support further to what I said earlier, Sarah, on the Equalities Act 2010 and the Public Sector Equality Duty are crystal clear about not being able to discriminate against LGBT plus community and ensure that all protected characteristics are supported and protected. And I think there was a failure by the Home Office, by DFE, and by National Police Chiefs Council and Constables not showing leadership on this issue. There should have been no prevaricating about the issue. Clearly, what we saw was harassment, intimidation, and overstepping the mark in terms of that public equality duty and the Equalities Act. And I think one of the other things that should be mentioned, it's been referenced in the Q&A, Heather, is the excellent work of the school role models from Stonewall, where there are people who have got personal experience who can go into schools and teach and speak to pupils and take questions from pupils, and they do a fantastic job, and there are other organisations that do as well. I should just say, in response to Rabbi Laura, I don't want to be misunderstood. I don't think Rabbi Laura was misunderstanding. I wasn't holding up the Church of England as a kind of shining example. They do have a couple of pieces of work there around valuing God's children that I think are good best practice. It's whether or not they're being used right across the Church of England. I think that is a real issue and that we need to be holding them down on. And I think that was Anjum's point at the start as well. And it's that point that we all have a responsibility, I think, as Rabbi Laura said, to show leadership, whether we're from faith communities, community leaders in councils or teachers. But Sarah's absolutely right. The government fell short, and I think that we're not enough to act. There is very clear legislation on these matters.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're almost out of time. So if I could just ask the panelists to start to to perhaps sum up some of their feelings and thoughts. Perhaps if I go in reverse order to how we started. So, Rabbi Laura, you're up first.
Just hearing the number 28 is traumatic for me, I have to say, when Michael talked about it. And I just think we're much further along, and we are, thank God, but we're just not there.
Thank you. Anjum, would you like to come in?
Well, I say, you know, I'm going to go for the good old ones, you know, united we stand, you know, our unity is strength, our unity is power. Stand with us. You don't have to be Muslim LGBTQI. You don't have to have faith to stand with us, to stand, you know, to be on our side. You know, we just need to get beyond our differences. We need to have humanity. We need to have kindness. We need to appreciate and value people. You know, we need to be an allegiance, if you like, to be reckoned with. That really sets up something that is progressive, that is identifiable, that is tangible as working progressively, and actually having those conversations to build communities and not just shutting them down, and actually listening and being in that framework, as Sarah said. You know, we need to have, if you like, ultimately, we you know, where do we want to be? We want to be on the right side of history. The right side of history is not by demonizing groups of people in that way, the LGBT community in particular. And you know, and we need to just be really proud of our pride, if you like, and stand tall in that and stand united in that. I want to just say thank you very much for having me on the panel today, and thanks very much for having Imam on the panel. We are actually having a celebration of our 25th anniversary this year, so we've got a Muslim LGBT festival that will be happening, and I will share with all of you some of the things that come out of that.
Oh, thank you, and look forward to hearing more about the 25th anniversary. And well said. Michael, do you want to come in and say a few closing remarks?
You know, like Rabbi Laura, I just find it tragic and utterly unacceptable that 32 years on from the introduction of Section 28, in spite of the huge progress being made by us as a country, by society, by people who pioneered and campaigned on these issues, that an issue like Anderton Park was allowed to raise its head and rumble on because the government stood by and because a number of other people stood by and did, you know, that very little. I just think is unbelievable, really, and I think is a salutary reminder of the fact that the battles and the campaign for progress are never won on these issues, and that it's something that you have to constantly argue for. We should never allow a vacuum to be created and for the more extreme views to fill that vacuum in the way that they tried to do in Anderton Park. And I think Sarah, you know, and colleagues who join me on the panel are a shining example of making sure that we engage in that vacuum, that we argue for progress, we argue for equality, we argue for the values, as Anjum said at the start, that are universal values, and that we champion the argument that people should be able to love who they want to love. You know, we look around the world right now and we have a leader who argues he's the leader of the free world, who is arguing against some of the values we've all been talking about tonight. And you know, if that's not a wake-up call to all of us to make sure that we are playing our role in our respective educations and our groups within society, then I don't know what is. A huge thank you, Heather, to you, and a thank you to LGBT Labour, who, you know, right from the outset alongside Stonewall have been pioneers and champions for the values that Anjum talked about at the start of the panel tonight. And it's so great to be invited to speak alongside, you know, our esteemed panel guests and have some fantastic questions tonight. And I've certainly learned an awful lot from the questions and the panelists this evening. So thank you very much for inviting me. And the LGBT Labour Councillors Network and LGBT Labour is here for people on the you know, on the webinar tonight. So please do get in touch with us for LGBT Labour. There's a fantastic councillors about the things you can do as a councillor in terms of RSE in your local area, and we've heard some fantastic examples tonight. So thank you very much for inviting me, Heather. It's been very, very interesting and insightful.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael. And Sarah, would you like to make some closing remarks?
Well, you'll have to forgive me. Those people who know me, I'm a massive Shakespeare fan. So Shakespeare got this right nearly 500 years ago. And Shylock in A Merchant of Venice was being abused because he was Jewish. And he gave his famous speech, I don't know it word for word, but along the lines of, I am a Jew, hath not a Jew eyes, hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, fed with the same food, hurt by the same weapons, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is. If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, shall we not die? That's it. That's the Equality Act. You replace Jew. Am I not gay? Am I not a woman? Am I not old? Am I not disabled? Am I not bisexual? If you prick us, do we not bleed? That's it. It's so simple. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And we have to use this as a positive thing, not as something that's a negative thing that takes somebody to go to court to say, some people have two daddies and that's all right.
Thank you. Just remains for me to thank all my panelists and my unseen elves, which are the helpers behind the scene. So thank you, Rabbi Laura, Anjum Mouj, sorry, I can't pronounce that, but apologies. Michael Payne and Sarah Hewitt-Clarkson, and my unseen elves, I should make mention to include Lewis Adlington Lee, Jack Lubner, and Stephanie Lloyd, and thank you all for taking part. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.